but a good morning and an extremely warm welcome. My name is Natalie Dorman. I'm the Associate Director of the Herbert D. Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this roundtable on Miguel Vatter's important book, Living Law. The Katz Center is thrilled to partner with Professor Miriam Jerade of the Universidad Adolfo Ibáñez in Santiago de Chile to bring you this roundtable. It's the Katz Center's first such collaboration with Chile and hopefully not our last. The session is a busy one. We're jam-packed, but we're going to try hard to allow time for questions at the end. So if you have a question, please use the chat and write it there, or send the word question directly to me, Natalie Dorman, so that I know who to call on at the end of the session. Miriam is definitely the creative force behind this, and she seems to have been prevented from being with us at this very moment. I'm not sure why. Hopefully she will come any minute, but she was really this is her brainchild, and I'm sorry that she's not here. I'm sure we'll find out why, and hopefully all is well with Professor Jerade. So I'm going to step in and play her role, poorly, no doubt. And what I want to do is I'll introduce each speaker in turn, and then Professor Vatter will give a response to all the responses to his work, at which point we hope to welcome you to share your questions and interventions. So with that in mind, we are really pleased to welcome four terrific panelists this morning. We have Martin Kavka, David Flatto, Nitzan Lebovic, and Paula Schwebel. And we'll begin in roughly chronological order with Professor Flatto, who is a professor in the Faculty of Law and in the Department of Jewish Philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Welcome, David, and you are on.
Thank you so much, Natalie, for the introduction, and nice to meet you, Miguel. And congratulations. This is a fascinating and challenging and ambitious work, and I get that it's part of a larger project. I have to say up front, I begin with an apology because I feel like this is a challenge for me. I'm with a great company, and also a lot of the book is about modern Jewish thought and modern political theology, which are issues that fascinate me, but not my strong suit. So I'm gonna participate today and also learn. But I think the reason I was asked to come is because in a very interesting move, if you will, you situate this book and the larger argument about modern political theology against the backdrop of antiquity and especially the writings of Philo. And even there, I would hesitate to speak on behalf of, Philonic studies. There's certainly greater experts out there. But I am interested in the role of law and politics in Philo, and some of the ways themes in Philo resonate. So in that sense, I welcome the invitation, and I only have a few minutes. I want to make about 4 different types of comments. Miguel in his book's not per se interested in Philo, but in the reception of Philo, and especially in Goodenough's reading of Philo and how that resonated over time and its afterlife. But yet Goodenough is clearly a scholar who is interpreting and trying to do his best to make sense of Philo. So the first just set of comments is actually, I want to extend your argument and support your argument, Miguel, because I think there are themes within Philo, probably a lot of different passages if we had time, but just a few that I'll touch on briefly that I think extend some of your argument. The argument that you make in this chapter is that when Philo talks about kingship, we should not get confused. This monarchy really merges into democracy, or it's a messianic form of monarchy that in its deeper sense is democratic. And I think there are other senses where that plays out. It's interesting when Philo describes the king in the main passages about kingship, he calls the king archon. So in other words, a term of a governor, of a ruler, but not the term for king. He occasionally, when he refers to God, he calls him king, but otherwise, basileos, but otherwise he uses the term archon. And the way the archon, this ideal ruler is selected is through the people's selection. So it's literally a democratic process. It's the people who choose this ruler. Also, of course, a very dominant theme in the chapter is it's not so much about the king, but it's the king as a vehicle for the embodiment of law, nomos empsikos, and law as king, and the king sort of as a type of intermediary between God's law and the king's embodiment of the law, and then others imitating. And again, here I think you could see these themes being elaborated on in various ways. First of all, the law that Philo's talking about is law for all people. True, it's law of the Torah, but it's nature's law and the universe's law. And also Philo very much insisting that the law does not need to be enforced and not coerced. And really it has to be encouraged and inspired, but not so for it to really be, this universal law, we can't expect its implementation in sort of the classical senses of law as enforced. And then one last point, just in this first set of points, is that you describe it as extra ecclesiam, that this law doesn't really have, or this state doesn't really have administrators. But Philo does need to deal with the issue of, okay, but who is responsible for the law? And one thing I've argued is, interestingly, for Philo, there's not one answer. You might think that the king in the ideal state is in charge of enforcing the law, but actually Philo gives a composite and a complex answer. He talks about the responsibility of the king. He talks about the responsibility of the high priest. He talks about the responsibility of judges in the courts. And then he even talks about the responsibility of individuals. And he doesn't really coordinate any of this, which in a sense, I think reinforces your theme that law is king and the law is transcendent, and there's no one, I don't know if it's extra ecclesiam, but it transcends any one authority or body. So that's the first set of points. I want to briefly, just really briefly, just mention a rabbinic passage, which is well known among scholars of rabbinic literature, but I think it's interesting to bring up here when we talk about living law. And that is a Yerushalmi passage, which is also in the Midrash, about describing the Gentiles, and about the Gentiles citing a Greek adage, parabasileos nomos agrapos, that concerning the king, the law is unwritten, meaning that's the way of the Gentiles. They treat the king as not being governed by a written law. And this is used as a contrasting point to talk about the rabbis. And according to the rabbis, of course, the law is written for all, not only for the mortal king, but even for the divine king. Even God lives under the nomos graphos, the written law. Now that's interesting to bring into conversation with Philo and this idea of a living law. Clearly, the rabbis are skeptical of unwritten law. I'm sort of linking unwritten law with living law, because I think these concepts do merge and blur. So the rabbis are skeptical, I think, of an idea of unwritten law for a idyllic ruler who is an embodiment of the law, because they see that as, sort of slipping into tyranny. And these are themes in your chapter. You talk about one of the sort of striking arguments is that that Philo, or at least Goodenough's reception of Philo, is erasing the division between ideal king and tyrant. That they sort of, that concern isn't there. And I wonder whether, the rabbinic sort of fear of a type of slippage to a Schmittian model is one that, they're right to have. That's on the one hand with the rabbis. But then the other thing I want to think about or ask is, imagine for a second that it's not Philo whose work ended up having this afterlife in Western thought, but it was the rabbis. What would happen if we had this sort of construct of the rabbis where everybody is under the written law. Because at the end of the day, we get to that equality that you talk about at the end of the chapter. At the end of the chapter, you discuss how one of the indicia of democracy is that everybody's equal under the law. And in a sense, for the rabbis, how jarring even God is equal under the law. And I wonder what would happen in that imaginary, if that had been the formative sort of conception, how things would have played out. I want to quickly make two more sets of points. The third one's going to take a minute or two, and the fourth one will be very brief. The third one is when you talk about democracy in the chapter, I think you refer to different aspects of democracy. And I'm not sure how they intersect. Do they intersect? One of the factors you talk about is that everybody potentially can be kingly. This is an emphasis you make. In other words, everybody can imitate the king. It's true that there's a king who's the living law, but everybody could be imitate the king, and in the sense of being self-sufficient and living virtuously, etc. So that's one aspect of being equal. Another aspect of being, of democracy. Another aspect of democracy is that everybody is free, and everybody is not restrained, and everybody in this idyllic society of described by Philo as Goodenough elaborates, everybody has the freedom to choose to live like the king, to imitate the king, to live virtuously. And again, the king just a proxy for God and God's law, etc. But in other words, so when we're talking about democracy, you emphasize the fact that everybody's potential, the fact that everybody has freedom to use their rational capacities to choose well. And then you talk about everybody being equal under the law. And some of these factors, like those first two, to me, they they strike of a politics of perfectionism. And I wonder whether, are they democratic, at least in the sense of really being inclusive? Because true, potentially everybody could be like the king, and everybody could not be restrained, and everybody could be virtuous, and everybody could use their reason. But that's a pretty high bar. And I wonder whether it's missing something, some things that are in Philo, where Philo works hard, I think, in his construct to really include everybody. There's the living law, but then there's the written law that is the copy of the living law. And that written law serves everybody. You even cite in the beginning of the chapter, Carlos Frankel's reading of, the written law as sort of bringing everybody in and showing them the way to at least conduct themselves in the virtuous life. And I wonder whether you sort of leave that out in your account. And or another way to maybe ask that question is, what is the parallel of the written law in the modern democracy? I think at the very end of the chapter, you sort of give a messianic account of it, but I wonder whether there's just a more functional way of including everybody with some version of positive law. The positive law needs to play an important role. And my last comment is there's something that Philo has, another thing that you omit, and I wonder whether, whether you agree that you omit, and also whether that sort of changes the calculus. I think there's another sense where Philo speaks to everybody in the ideal society. And that really ties back to what I said at the outset, that who's responsible for the law? It's not just the king, it's not just the high priest, it's not just the judges, it's everybody. And Philo, in a very striking passage, when he restates the verses of the Shema, for Philo, it's not just to study the law, but the Shema, the Dvarim are, the principles of justice, and everybody is responsible for the principles of justice. And I think responsible for societal fulfillment of the principles of justice. So it's not that just everybody could be virtuous or that everybody could, use their rational faculties, but that everybody, it's not just the rights of everybody, but it's the responsibilities of everybody in society. And I think that's an important dimension. Philo, this is sort of very typically Jewish, I would say, but if we're talking about a Jewish political theology, I wonder what happens to that emphasis on the collective, even the popular responsibility.
All right, thank you so much, David. I'm thrilled to see that Professor Miriam Jerade has joined us. And since this is her program, I will happily hand the reins to Miriam. Miriam.
I have to unmute myself. Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to see you all here. I'm very sorry. I thought it was 1 hour ahead in Mexico City. So I just want to welcome you and to say you how excited I am to be here. Let me first begin by saying how grateful I am to two organizations behind our conversations, the CAT Center, which was for many of us an academic home, and the Faculty of Liberal Arts at the University Adolfo Ibáñez. I just want to very shortly say that in a seminar that we organized in Chile with Miguel on his book, he told me that he never had a conversation with the Jewish philosophy scholars. So I decided to organize this conversation. I thought it was important for both fields, for political theory and for Jewish studies. So that's why I decided to invite some friends and scholars that I admire. And so thank you for joining us, and I hope to have a nice conversation. I may present the next speaker, Natalie, who...
Martin is next, only David has spoken.
Okay, so wait a minute, I have to present. Sorry. I know everyone knows Martin at this point. I don't know if it's important to introduce you to Martin Kavka. He's professor of religion at Florida State University, and his primary research interest is the discourse of modern Jewish philosophy. His first book, Jewish Messianism and the History of Philosophy, argued that a significant strand of thinkers in the modern Jewish philosophical canon, Hermann, Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, and Emmanuel Levinas, with some premonitions in the writings of Moses Maimonides, grounded their defense of Jewish messianism in a philosophical account of the nature of the non-being and potentiality. Well, I introduce you to Martin Kavka, who will have 10 minutes, and it's very nice to see you, Martin, here. Thank you.
It's nice to see you too, Miriam. Thanks so much for your work in organizing this, Miriam. Thanks to the CAT Center for its co-sponsorship, and thanks to all of you who are here on a very busy day. I'm really grateful to you, and it's a deep pleasure for me to be able to participate in this celebration of Miguel Vatter's excellent book, Living Law, which forcefully pushes Jewish thought in a new and helpful direction in a way that outsiders always do for this small field of Jewish thought. It generates lots of work for future scholars working in this field. In my short time, I want to glory in the book's counterintuitive and correct, in my view, argument, and then say something about some puzzlements that I have about the book. Those puzzlements aren't about the details of the argument. Rather, they're about the next steps that we in the field might take. Because the book forces scholars of Jewish thought to make more precise arguments. But I, at times, while reading the book, have wondered whether that precision actually contains some threats about what Jewish political thought might look like. All right, so let me begin by saying something about the argument. What Vatter has done in Living Law is delineate a tradition of Jewish political theology that he has described as a kind of democratic theocracy, a model in which, quoting an essay by Erwin Goodenough on Philo, as David said earlier, the world is ruled by God, and that means that all created things, even persons among themselves, are equal before the higher reality of the Logos law. Humans are a blend of the material and immaterial for Philo, and this means that they are citizens of the universal state. Their task is a strange mix of world affirmation, because you affirm state structures, and world denial, because the universal state does not yet exist. And for Vatter, this Jewish vision is in opposition to a Christian account of politics, in which God is successfully and fully represented in the world, although only in the ruler and not in the ruled. What's so refreshing about the tradition that Vatter excavates here, not only in Philo, but also across a cast of characters who aren't always seen on the same page of much philosophy or political theory: Hermann Cohen, Franz Rosenzweig, Gershom Scholem, Leo Strauss, and Hannah Arendt, is its oppositional nature. That's the glory of Vatter's book. For the last 2 or 3 generations of scholarship, the territory of Jewish thought in which I have been trained has been a territory in which Judaism and Christianity are on the side of religion in its battle against the perceived bad consequences of secularization, and in which a Jewish thinker can be too philosophical, too much on the side of Athens, and threaten the independence and godliness of religion. But in Vatter's tradition, Athens is not Jerusalem's enemy. Rather, Athens and Jerusalem are made to team up against Roman Christianity. Let me be clear about what this means. For many scholars in Jewish thought, being Hellenized is a problem. But as I read Vatter's tradition, the critique that he wants to make is that Christian thinkers aren't philosophical enough, aren't Hellenized enough. Philo has shown us how to Hellenize properly, how to adopt Hellenism in order to overcome it, in Vatter's phrase. It's this willingness to stand apart from Christians, to look askance at them and to dispute them, that makes living law a sea change in Jewish thought and theology. For both autobiographical and intellectual reasons, I want more of this from my field. I want more of this from my colleagues at a wide variety of institutions. And I want more of this from Vatter also. I want future projects in which we get lengthier treatments of why Franz Rosenzweig might be correct to say that people who adhere to revealed religions should not organize themselves as nation states do. Or how we might construct a fuller version of Vatter's story that Franz Rosenzweig took Paul to be more spurious than Islam. But if the story that Vatter wants to tell is one that says that Jewish thought needs to embrace Hellenism and that Christians should do so even more because Jews have already done it, it's unclear to me what exactly that might mean. Goodenough described Philo's vision as grounded in a mystic and ascetic urge. And that seems not quite a good description of the German Jewish thinkers whom Vatter analyzes in Living Law, and in particular Hermann Cohen. Mysticism for Cohen is always associated with myth. He thought of asceticism as a kind of anti-worldly shortcut that too quickly assumed that humans need to transcend nature in order to be happy. I agree that Philo offered a democratic theocracy. I agree that Cohen offered one, and that Cohen is close to what Vatter calls a principle of anarchy that he gets from the Heidegger scholar Rainer Schurman. And on that principle of anarchy, the difference between the world and its ground justifies an anarchic stance toward power arrangements. It justifies an emphasis on mutability. But at a certain point, I worry that placing all these thinkers in the same tradition ends up occluding certain things as it highlights others. When we pin down the likeness between Cohen and Philo, as Vatter asks us to do, the unlikeness between them suddenly comes on the scene. If Philo might be too mythic for Cohen, neither do I think that it would be more fair to say that Cohen would be Hellenized because he's always on the side of Greek philosophy against myth. Vatter suggests this in what I believe are instinctively correct sentences on what he calls Cohen's esoteric teaching, namely that the same affinity that German philosophy feels toward Greek philosophy is what opens for Germans the possibility of becoming Jews by choice. For Cohen, Vatter says, human freedom consists in the freedom to choose to be Jewish when one is not born a Jew. This is the functional equivalent to the freedom to philosophize. That's the end of the long quote from Vatter. But in whose tradition are we free to philosophize? For all the times in Cohen's corpus that he praises Plato for his ethical idealism and mentions the concept of the good beyond being that appears in Plato's Republic, Vatter rightly points out that in Cohen's 1907 essay, Religion and Ethics, Cohen rejects Plato's political philosophy because it limits scientific knowledge and therefore ethical action to the elite classes. And that's not just 1907 Cohen. The same sentiment appears in a brief discussion in the Messianism chapter of Cohen's posthumously published Religion of Reason out of the Sources of Judaism. And even though after Goodenough's reading of Philo might lead us to think that Cohen would have criticized Philo as being on the side of myth, in a brief sentence in Religion of Reason, Cohen actually criticizes Philo for being overwhelmed by Greek philosophy and unable to assert himself in purely monotheistic terms. For Cohen, monotheism is better than philosophy, and both are better than myth. But mapping out the relations between those three categories, monotheism, philosophy, myth, becomes difficult when we go into the details of Cohen or Philo or other thinkers whom Vatter treats. Vatter's correct, I think, to say that the tradition of political theology that he delineates is one in which Jews adopt Hellenism in order to overcome it. But if overcoming Hellenism is the goal, is there really any adoption going on at all? Is the temporary adoption of Hellenism just a heuristic device in order to persuade non-Jewish readers that the thought on display is not merely myth, or in order to persuade Jewish readers that it's not merely Greek philosophy? I don't find any systematic answer to this in Cohen, either exoteric or esoteric. The adoptions of Hellenism are always partial. They don't seem to stick. And that means that we have to answer the following questions now after reading Vatter's book. First, if Jews are able to articulate themselves as Jews by adopting a kind of Hellenistic tone, then who are the Greeks whom they adopt? And if we cannot answer that first question with any surety, then are Jews ever able to articulate themselves and their political theologies as Jews? Thank you very much for your time and attention. It's really a thrill to be here.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's always so interesting to hear you. And I'm looking forward for the discussion with the public. If you have questions, you can write them in the chat. And I forget to thank my colleagues, Paula, Martin, Nitzan, and David for their willingness and interest in joining this conversation. Our next speaker is Nitzan Lebovic. Nitzan is an associate professor of history and the Apter Chair of Holocaust Studies at the Ethical Values at Lehigh University. He received his BA in the History and Theory of Literature from the Tel Aviv University and his PhD from UCLA. His first book, titled The Philosophy of Life and Death, Ludwig Klages and the Rights of a Nazi Biopolitics, focused on the circle around the Lebensphilosopher and anti-Semitic thinker Ludwig Klages. His second book, about Zionism and Melancholia, The Short Life of Israel Sarhi, was published in Hebrew in 2015 and he's expected soon in English. Nitzan is also the co-editor of The Politics of Nihilism and of Catastrophe and History, The Theory of an Operative Concept. Welcome, Nitzan.
Thank you very much, Miriam. I should update my the website, I think, because some of this information is no longer updated. But thank you very, very much for the invitation to speak here. It's a great honor to be among some of the people I really admire most in the field in this area. And thank you, Miriam. Thank you, of course, Natalie and the Katz Center. And thank you, Professor Vatter, Miguel Vatter, for inviting us to share this conversation with you. What I'm going to do here shortly in the 10 minutes I have is to try and actually give a very wide overview of the argument and move with that into the two chapters that I was assigned to comment about. I'm going to do that in the form of raising a few questions after the very broad overview, just to move from the broad argument into the specific applications, if you like, of the living law here. This is the third book I have already by Vatter on my shelf. In previous books, he was talking about both law and life and the concept of life, the living law, right? But in different contexts, specifically in The Republic of Living, his previous book, he was talking about biopolitics or the biopolitical theory critique, where he talked about law and the state and police vis-a-vis what he grasps as a positive notion of eternity, so a notion of temporality of the law and of life that is standing against what we've been talking about here with David and Martin before me as the law, the structure of the law in the secular state. Specifically, Vatter talks about natality and normativity when he talks about biopolitical critique. So natality, a concept we identify nowadays with Hannah Arendt, and normativity vis-a-vis the government of life, or people who know this area, biopolitical critique would identify immediately a Foucauldian understanding of life, life, law, and the state. And behind that, we saw in previous books, as well as in this one, a very long commitment, very serious commitment to the idea of republicanism, which I guess we'll be talking more about today. And the argument here has to do really with, so continuing or building on top of this form of biopolitical critique, or what Vatter calls in previous books affirmative biopolitics, which here kind of slides into an understanding of the critical tools of what he talks about, for instance, in post-Nietzschean terms, as affirmative nihilism, identifying Gershom Scholem's thinking with affirmative nihilism, and a strong critique that David and Martin talked about in terms of anarchists, a certain commitment to anarchists, the anarchist aspect of Republican politics. That means, in terms of, again, the biopolitical critique and a notion of life, Zoe, of biological life, survival, the bare life, but which Vatter adds to them a notion, a far longer and more metaphysical notion of eternity, or the prospect, the horizon of eternity, vis-a-vis what he calls necropolitics, or the notion of life vis-a-vis the killing of life, which are represented, and that's where it gets its more concrete appearance with forms of occupation, apartheid, racism, or the oppression of minorities, all of which are themes that we see again with Scholem and Arendt. So the two chapters I've been assigned to comment about here. So very briefly, that was kind of a very broad presentation of the argument and the continuity between previous works and this one. Here, as again, David and Martin did before me, the argument is building in a more historical fashion and leaps between the ancient Jewish and Hellenic integration of certain philosophical and scriptural interpretations straight into the modern era with German Jewish thought. And I'm going to say two very general things about that and then move into more concrete questions to Vatter. Well, again, keeping eye on the time. So the argument, and I'm not going to repeat the argument where it concerns Philo, has to do with German Jewish thinkers or thought incorporating or going back into ancient motifs specifically, and here he opens the chapter about Scholem, by actually, and Arendt, by actually applying their thought to the anarchic soul of theocracy, or a notion of divine life. Again, the temporal horizon here is one of eternity, and a Republican commitment to anti-sovereignty or the resistance to a human sovereign. So theocracy and anarchism and German Jewish thought following Philo are committed, according to this reading, to resistance to the law as represented by a human sovereign, but willing to commit to a certain notion of law that is represented by a divine force. Walter Benjamin is talking about that as well, and Vatter talks about the critique der Gewalt in his work in relation to both Scholem and Arendt. So with the German Jewish thinkers, what we see is actually also a historical leap, a smaller historical leap, moving from the integration of Hellenic or Hellenist culture and Judaism, moving into a different integration, that is the one, more politically and more legally more legal one, between Judaism and actually Roman political forms or the Roman law. And that is applied by both Scholem and Arendt in different ways. Scholem is going back into reading back from the politics of his time, his critique of Zionism, and we should say more about that. I'll be happy if he says more about that later on. But reading back a heterodoxic slew of interpretations. Arendt is, of course, taking after Roman law and the notion of Judaic, Judeo-Roman or Judeo-Christian understanding of law, following that, the tradition that we identify with Western law. And that brings me to more specific comments here. So Vatter here opens a very, very broad overview of different traditions and reads them back, reads them from the present moment and tries to reconstruct, reestablish in the tradition of Hannah Arendt and Gershom Scholem a hidden voice. And the hidden voice here is one of continuity of a Jewish political theology, contrasted, Martin talked about contrasts, oppositions here, contrasted with a Christian political theology. When we go back from the present moment into the ancient period, what we see is a tradition, a Jewish political theological tradition that is embedded, as we said, in theocracy, in anarchist motifs, and in history as a form of divine process. He contrasts that with human sovereignty, as we mentioned, or modern nationalism, with the Geist of nationalism, the Hegelian understanding of nationalism in the secular state, and this is one motive I'll want him to say more about, with the appearance of the katechon, the human sovereign, who is able to slow down or hopefully prevent for a while the coming of the end, of the apocalypse or destruction. Scholem goes back to looking at that Jewish political theology from the perspective of religious anarchism. Arendt is looking at that Jewish political theology, from the perspective of natality. And that opens a few big questions, and I'll ask them. 3 big questions for me. 1, is this opposition between Jewish political theology and Christian political theology, while the Christian political theology is one that you identify with a Schmittian and Heideggerian positions, or with a katechonic approach to modern sovereignty, really between Judaism and Christianity, or do you mean more specifically the one between a Jewish and Christian understanding of Republican or democratic traditions and a Paulinian resistance to the law? Arendt, as you note, and I think briefly and pass through, is committed to an Augustinian and more integrative understanding of the Jewish and the Christian traditions working together into the Novus Ordo Seclorum, right, into the new age that she tries to actually move us into, away from totalitarianism and away from the katechon, right? So that's one question. The second question, and a question that I'm dealing with very often is, when I talk about German Jewish studies, very often the question is that the response by the audience is one of exhaustion, a certain notion of exhaustion. Why again German Jews? Why again this reading? Why again this engagement that is so sophisticated and is so complex? And I think what the question really raises for me, because we are working in that field, is not specifically why German Jews, but what kind of misgivings can we act if they stopped and actually tried to our own day? I'll give you an example, which is theocracy, natality, republicanism are nowadays can be seen as obstacles to the discussion, for instance, of the Anthropocene, of the climate change, etc. So there are certain weaknesses that Scholem and Arendt in my chapters, or Rosenzweig, Cohen, and others actually cannot answer for. And finally, last question, you are talking in different places about Messianism, specifically in relation to the secularization. Scholem's critique of Zionism as a secularization of Messianic movement. But the way you seem to solve it, following the tradition of Philo and then the German Jews, is by advocating for a certain overcoming, Martin mentioned that as well, overcoming over Messianism based, grounded in the failure of the Messianic movement. The question here is, again, aren't we, and that brings the previous question into maybe focusing that more, aren't we then locking ourselves within a modern form of Aufhebung, right, a Hegelian structure that, after all, doesn't allow us to actually move away from that old notion of the 20th century engagement, German Jewish engagement with the 19th century. So what does the 21st century really allow us to see that they didn't? And with that, I thank you very, very much. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you, Nitzan. Thank you very much. Very good questions at the end. And so now our last speaker is Paula Schwebel. Paula Schwebel is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Ryerson University in Toronto. She has published on Walter Benjamin, Gershom Scholem, and Franz Rosenzweig. Her current research is on 20th century readings of early modern political philosophy and political theologies, with a focus on Walter Benjamin and Carl Schmitt. Welcome, Paula.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Natalie and the CAT Center for organizing this. Miguel, for the pleasure of your wonderful book. As always, and thanks to my fellow panelists. I'm going to read my comments to keep within the 10 minutes. So in my commentary, I explore two arguments made in living law. First, that Jewish political theology in the 20th century may be traced to a species of Neoplatonism. And second, that Jewish political theology has democratic implications. I want to interrogate the relationship between a Judaized Platonism and a democratic politics, especially as this relationship is construed in the chapter on Leo Strauss. The genealogical argument put forward by Miguel's book is that Jewish political theology unfolds within the horizon of a Platonic political philosophy. This genealogy is traced back to Philo, as we heard with David, but the reading together of Jewish theocracy and Platonism is carried out most forcefully by Leo Strauss. And although Miguel reads Strauss as an inheritor of Cohen, I would suggest that the project in Living Law, including the reading of Cohen as a political theologian, is carried out within a Straussian frame. That is, I think Strauss sets the question of what is at stake in this book by interpreting Revelation as a higher law. Let me briefly reconstruct the Platonic political philosophy at the heart of Strauss's argument in Philosophy and Law. According to Strauss, religion is taken up by medieval Jewish and Islamic philosophers as law. It is thus conceived as a political fact corresponding to the field of political philosophy. This political philosophy is interpreted within a Platonic horizon. Its classical texts are Plato's Republic and the Laws. For medieval Islamic and Jewish philosophers, the law is conceived of as divine law, given by God through the prophet. Like the Platonic philosopher king, the prophet is the lawgiver of the perfect political community. But the prophet is not only a philosopher, the prophet must also be a political leader and founder of the ideal community. The law, so understood, is not a system of abstract norms, but a unitary total regimen of human life. That's a quote from Strauss's Philosophy and Law. The second argument that I want to sketch is Miguel's suggestion that Jewish political theology has a radical democratic thrust. If Strauss gives the most forceful expression of the genealogical argument, then it's Cohen who is the progenitor of the second argument. In Miguel's words, it is no exaggeration to say that all of the German Jewish thinkers treated in these pages intuitively grasped what Cohen was after, to articulate the social revolutionary significance of Jewish theocracy. Drawing on the chapters on Goodenough's Philo and on Cohen, we might distill the following claims about the democratic significance of Jewish theocracy. First, the divine law corresponds with no positive set of religious or political laws. The non-identity between the divine law and any and all positive laws may be construed as emancipatory, in that it divests political and religious institutions of their authority over human beings. Second, the divine law's mode of rule is non-coercive. In Cohen and Goodenough, the divine law is non-coercive because it rules through reason, and hence is a kind of rational self-rule, as opposed to forced obedience. And third, the content of the divine law is natural justice. In Philo, divine revelation takes the form of principles of equality, and in Cohen, the messianic idea imparted by the teachings of the Torah exhorts us to a unified idea of humanity, which calls on us to overcome relationships of domination between people. In the chapter on Strauss, Miguel also makes a case for reading Strauss's Platonic theocracy as, quote, containing a radical democratic teaching, closed quote. I confess that of all the arguments in this masterful book, I find the one reconciling Strauss's Platonic theocracy with a democratic teaching to be the most difficult to grasp. Miguel's argument for interpreting Strauss's project as democratic is based on the following claims, which have a certain parity to the arguments made by Goodenough's Philo and Cohen. First, in light of the idea of divine law as, quote, a unitary total regimen of human life, close quote, Miguel argues that the only authority that can act as such a guide for human life as a whole, including its physical and intellectual perfection, is a prophetically given divine law. Since no human authority is able to provide such guidance, the argument withdraws legitimacy from any human authority that presumes to have constituent power. Second, the mode of rule of the divine law is non-coercive. This is not because it rules through reason, as is the case in Philo and Cohen, but because of an act of faith in the fact of the divine law. And third is the claim that for Strauss, divine law is always addressed to everyone, and thus the standpoint of faith in revelation has a radically democratic character. Miguel elaborates that this is because despite being a particular unitary legal order, the divine law is nonetheless both universal and necessary. It is universal because it satisfies the human individual's need for guidance, and it is necessary because humans as political beings need to live under the law. In other words, this is an appeal to natural justice, developed from a state of nature best described by Plato and Aristotle, quote, as characterized by the givenness of divine law and the natural human need of guidance, close quote. What I want to interrogate further in the time that I have left is what seems to me to be the tensions or incompatibilities between Strauss's conception of Platonic theocracy and the idea of Judaism as a divine democracy, which Strauss reads into, which Miguel, sorry, Freudian slip, reads into Strauss's argument. On my reading, there are certain undemocratic, if not anti-democratic features of Strauss's argument. First, even though an argument is made that everyone in principle is addressed by the fact of revelation, a claim that seems to have egalitarian implications, Strauss is actually defending a view of, quote, the natural inequality among men, close quote, a view which, according to Miguel, is adopted by the medieval Platonists through their reception of the Aristotelian idea of nature as, quote, an ordered whole which consists of beings of different ranks, close quote. The position naturalizes political inequality, epitomized by Maimonides' argument that, quote, some beings achieve perfection to an extent that enables them to govern others, whereas others achieve a perfection only in the measure that allows them to be governed by others. That's a quote from the guide. This division of humanity into different ranks reestablishes the relationships of ruler and ruled, against which Cohen had strenuously, and I believe rightly, objected. Second, it's difficult for me to get past the fact that the standpoint of faith in revelation corresponds to the revelation as interpreted by the prophets of a particular religion. The prophetically given law in Judaism is not going to be acceptable to Muslims or Christians, and vice versa. Yet if the divine law is mediated to human beings by the prophets of different religious traditions, the prophetically given divine law can at best be the form of legality accepted by specific faith communities, as is the case with the Torah and Sharia law. Even if such a law is read as a form of natural justice, it cannot, as particular unitary legal order, be the foundation of a democratic politics that also includes people of different faiths. And finally, Strauss's vision of a Platonic theocracy is of a unitary total order of human life. Miguel refers to this idea, but doesn't spell out the concrete implications of this point. I find helpful John McCormack's elaboration of this idea as an all-encompassing regimen that rigorously conditions all dimensions of individual and community life by instilling, quote, habits of behavior with respect to sexuality, art, education, hygiene, economics, etc., close quote. According to Miguel, the only kind of authority that can act as such a guide for human beings must be a prophet, since such authority can only be divine. In other words, the requirement of the divine law to rule over life in its totality, in its external and internal dimensions, distinguishes it absolutely from human forms of authority. But I remain concerned about the authoritarian and homogenizing implications of a law that governs life as a totality. My intuition is that in a genuine democracy, human differences need to be resolved in a way that preserves difference and plurality, rather than dissolving these in a unified higher order. So to sum up, I have difficulty understanding how Miguel reconciles Strauss's notion of a Platonic theocracy with the idea of Judaism as a divine democracy. Since the central claim of Miguel's book is that Jewish theocracy ultimately takes the form of divine democracy, at least in the thinkers treated in this book, grappling with the tensions between these ideas in Strauss has bearing on the central question raised by the book as a whole, namely, whether there can be a theocratic basis for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Well, now it's Miguel time to respond to all these very interesting and in-depth comments. Nice to see you.
Thank you, Miriam. What a gift. So first of all, I too would like to thank Natalie Dorman and the Herbert D. Katz Center for hosting this roundtable. Miriam, of course, who, as she said, came up with the idea and worked to organize it. Thank you so much. And Paula, Martin, Nitzan, and David for incredibly generous and really challenging presentations, to which I'm obviously, by definition, won't be able to live up to. So just quickly, let me start with, I guess, David. And here, of course, begins a kind of exculpation of sorts, in the sense that David has written masterfully, as I just recently read, on Philo's jurisprudence, and I wish I had known this. I don't know if it would have overlapped, but in any case, in the future, he has explained beautifully everything really about Philo's kingship and its relationship to the law and democracy. So I won't repeat it here. But my point, just like he also said, I am no expert really in anything, but much less in Philo. So I try to be very modest in taking up just good enough interpretation of Philo, and I contextualize it with other 20th century readings of Philo. But good enough here was for me an interesting discovery, simply because he had such a crucial role to play in establishing the very discourse of political theology. Although I don't think Schmidt read him, he was cited by Peterson in Peterson's refutation of Schmidt, and that's how I arrived to good enough. I had no idea of his existence, and then I learned later that of his very important work, especially on Philo. I loved what David said about the Messianic monarch being called Archon and not Basileus in Philo and selected democratically. And here, I think it plays into my idea in the book that arche I tend to interpret more as authority as opposed to kratos, power. And so I make a big deal somewhere about Josephus' definition of theocracy, and it's dividing itself into arche and kratos. So to me, this adds to the general presentation that David made of Philo's kingship that is oriented more towards the problem of legal authority and not the problem of executive power, the problem of application, or the problem of enforcement. David mentions, in Philo, who is responsible for the law? And it's not just the king, but also the judges, the high priest, the whole community. And I agree entirely. But I think this just goes to show a point that Elazar already made at length, that according to him, Moses, the Torah, and so on, does not determine a specific form of government. So there is a gap there that in part, this is what anarchy means, that divine law does not determine a specific form of government. And that is why several actors come into play here, upholding the law or this mystical crown. Now, the second, and of course, I love for the Gentiles, the philosophical king is not governed by written law, but for the rabbis, all law is written even for God. And this I tried to discuss, but I'm very ignorant about these things. But in Scholem's kind of complicated discourse about an Ur Torah and how it relates to the written Torah and the oral Torah, that I get myself confused because it's so complicated and obscure to me, of course. But I understand this point. And I think David says that this emphasis on a written law as opposed to a living law was meant to make us aware that that the monarch is a living law, despite everything that we said of how democratic and so on, there is a risk of us slipping into tyranny. And I think that is correct. I think that's correct. I'm not sure that sticking to written law saves us, right? Let's take an example that would have been close to probably Strauss. I think he speaks about it several times and has come up several times, which is sort of Lincoln, for example, as a kind of living law in the sense of animating again the promise found in the Declaration of Independence of equality and abolition of slavery, but needing to, in a certain sense, take exception to the written constitution, engage in civil war, and so on and so forth. So, depending, of course, how one reads it, one can say, well, there is a tyrannical element here as well of living law. And I think that's unavoidable to a certain extent. This danger is constitutive of the idea of constitutional power. And it's tied also to the question of violence, of course. Then David talks about is the fact that in Philo everybody can be kingly because everybody has a mind to develop, and therefore law, which is rational, can only be accepted on a rational basis. Is this, which is, by the way, how we understand public reason and therefore democratic legitimacy, how we should understand it unless we're Hobbesian. Is this perfectionist? And doesn't the written law help everybody to educate themselves, to have the rational independence, so to speak, to be able to live under law in this free way? I think yes and yes, or I don't see really there a big dilemma, though David mentions the work of Carlos Frankel, which for me is very important, and I mention it as well. But Carlos Frankel, as opposed to good enough, he, I think, as I understand it, takes religion to be that part of philosophy that helps those who are not naturally philosophers to kind of approximate at a moral level what philosophical life is really about. And that's not the way I interpret what Philo or Cohen or everybody else is about. And with this I transition to Martin, I think there is a sense in which for Cohen and this tradition, religion in one sense is of course higher than philosophy. Okay, so if I may, I transition to Martin's wonderful remarks. And again, this is not even an apology, this is a complete lapsus on my part. Preparing for this panel, I went back for the first time, I must confess, to read Martin's 204 book, which is fascinating. I got stuck from 214 afterwards, everything that you've written on Jewish political theology, and I forgot to go back to the source, which is a lapsus. But anyways, and where there's a fantastic discussion of Cohen and Maimonides, which would have spared me a lot of ink and trouble because in many ways we overlap so closely. So here I'll just jump to I think to the question, which is why do Jews or Judaism need Greek philosophy? Does it really need it, or is it just a strategic moment, even historically determined? And I think Cohen says that it's not only Judaism, but in general, all religions need philosophy in order to free themselves from a mythical understanding of religion. And by mythical, it means a kind of vertical relationship between the human and the divine, a hierarchical one, that in a certain sense omits the messianic denouement of the relational correlation between humanity and God, which is ultimately a correlation between human beings and their own humanity in a sense of radical equality. So I think in that sense, Judaism, perhaps, at least for Cohen, I think will need philosophy to get beyond, perhaps it's necessary or intrinsic mythical dimensions that pertain to all religion. Now, how does it do it? According to Cohen, as I read it, it does it because it adopts two ideas. First, a philosophical or Platonic idea of nature. This, on the one hand, is meant to justify the possibility of science, understanding nature according to the scientific method, through hypotheses, through axioms and principles. But in the Platonic sense, nature is, as it were, delimited by a higher telos, which in Plato is the idea of the good. So in that sense, for Cohen, all scientific work has a practical, ethical, political finality. It is not, science is not a good in itself and for itself. I find that a very interesting idea, but I mean, we can talk about it more. And the second thing, of course, that the Greek philosophy brings, again in the Platonic mode, is a philosophical idea of politics. That is that, politics should be conducted dialectically as an exchange of reasons. One should not obey unless one is rationally persuaded. Natural right is, in a certain sense, reason, and for the opposite of the right of the stronger. And without that, without this force of reason in politics, we cannot really have proper politics. Okay, fine. Now, and why does philosophy for Cohen need Judaism? And I think here, I won't repeat what Martin said, but Cohen's idea is that philosophy needs religion to attain this dimension or this of humanity beyond natural enmity, I think. Well, that's very quickly. All right, I've been told to hurry up. Nitzan, thanks so much. You and I share this interest in biopolitics, and you're completely right to foreground it here. I think I'll just go to one point there, which you say that I think that in Scholem and Arendt, history is a kind of divine process. I'm not sure. What I try to argue is that they take hold of this idea that tradition, the Jewish tradition, perhaps all traditions, are alive through its own crisis, and that there is always a counter tradition at work. And so I see this very much in Rosenzweig when he says at one point from a letter, he says, well, I'm only sure about God and the kingdom, his kingdom, but everything in between, it does not have meaning. So unlike Lebovic that thinks that modern philosophy is all about giving meaning to history, I think these thinkers problematize whether history can be meaningful, and therefore it's more like the ruins that Benjamin talks about. And I would agree with what you said, that the opposition between Christian and Jewish political theology, I'm talking about political theology, I'm not talking about Christianity or Judaism, I'm talking about a specific kind of discourse. And in that sense, within this discourse, yes, there can be a continuity or an alliance between Jewish and Christian on the Republican side, as exemplified, for example, by Arendt. But in order to contrast a Paulinian idea of law, which is instead the one that's been favored these days by Zizek, Agamben, and others, which is more antinomian, but for me is problematic, because for me republicanism makes no sense without a strong conception of the rule of law. Yeah, why again German Jews? Well, I don't know. That's of course a very good question. Can they help us? I mean, I try to evade that question by simply saying, look, I'm sticking to a discursive regularity called political theology. It was coined by Schmidt. I think Cohen anticipates the problem, and Schmidt might have been indirectly reacting to that. I think Heidegger was directly reacting to that, and that opened up for me. And also, it was simply a process of discovery. As I would say in a second, I started from Strauss, and then once I had read more Cohen, this back and forth made me see that there was a kind of strong continuity there. But of course, one could have done this with perhaps French also, Levinas I leave out, and so on and so forth. Okay, Messianism and Zionism is too complicated. I'll skip over it, I'm allowed. And Paula, yeah, thanks for this brilliant dissection, and I think deconstruction of my whole argument. You're right that Strauss could risks throwing everything out of the window, right, in a certain sense. And I too am quite ambivalent. I try to put the best face onto Leo Strauss that I can in this book. But if you read my previous things, I was much more skeptical, right, about this. I think what's happening is, I think are Cohen and Strauss ultimately compatible or not? Strauss at one point says that Cohen is overall right about his reading of Maimonides as a Platonist and what this implies, except that he doesn't take into account seriously enough Aristotle in his whole thing. Now, what does that mean? And that's the problem that I put, and this is not just in the 20th century, but perhaps all history of philosophy. How do we put together Plato and Aristotle? But in this case, I think Aristotle could be an argument in favor of Strauss as being more democratic. Why? What does Aristotle add in a certain sense, right? He adds, for example, the need to always base political power on the consent of the citizens and on their participation. So in Aristotle, it is true that he maintains the distinction between ruler and ruled, but under the Constitution, he says these switch around. In general, Aristotle makes Plato more realistic and more political, right? So Strauss says that Plato doesn't invent political science, it's Aristotle that does. And that means that there is attention to the structure of the regimes that, in a certain sense, are supposed to apply, if one wishes, a divine law that, in a certain sense, cannot be applied. So I think Strauss liked to cite something perhaps the audience will know. I think a passage, I'm not sure which rabbinical source it is, but he loves to cite it, something to the effect that, if it weren't for a sovereign or the state, we'd be at each other's throats and we'd never even start on the process to get to any messianic kingdom because we'd be all dead. So there is this kind of deep realism there that Cohen that doesn't have. On the other hand, in terms of, his principal idea is that human beings need the guidance of the law. Without law, no freedom. I think this can be interpreted quite Republican, right? So, and then we finally get, and by the way, there's a nice quote that in a way you're right, that it encapsulates the whole project. And Strauss says, quote, "The idea of law is what unifies Jews and Greeks, the idea of the concrete binding order of life." And so everything depends on how we understand this concrete order, right? And the way I understand it is that basically we have a problem of application in jurisprudence, namely that the law does not apply itself, but needs to be applied by some sort of authority to have force. Now, as I read Scholem, the emphasis is actually on deconstructing that and pointing out how the divine law is radically inapplicable. Strauss is at the opposite end. He wants the divine law radically applicable. And I think he does that because of what he and everybody else experienced as a kind of what happens when you're in a state of exception to the law, right? In Nazi Germany and at other times and places. And so one cannot accept that a system of law in which any part or the whole system as a whole can be disapplied, right? And I think the only thing that gives an assurance that formal laws will be applied is what it means by concrete order of law. Law has to be always in a concrete order that assures to the people who are living in this regime that law will always be applied in all areas of life, so that no part of life can ever fall outside of divine law. And that what that means, I approximate to Derrida's discussion about the distinction between a bare life and a just life, right? That there is no aspect of life that should fall outside of justice in a way. Now, does this mean that, you know, the Sharia is one way only and there is only one interpretation? No, because Strauss says that the Sharia and the Torah and all divine laws prophetically given also necessarily open up the right to philosophize about the law. And once you bring in philosophy there as a way of interpretation, I think then you open it up much more, perhaps not quite to the kind of liberalism or liberal order that maybe you have in mind, but that's another point of discussion. Okay, so thank you everyone.
Thank you, Miguel. We have really short time for questions. I have some names. The first one is Bruce Rosenstock.
Yes, thank you. And Miguel knows how much I love his book. So I won't say anything about it, but I want to respond to something that Martin was raising, and that is the conflict between Jerusalem and Athens. And what I wanted to bring up was a comment at a very meta level, namely that the interest in the law and in democracy and in sovereignty seems to be at some orthogonal relation to something that has been typically described as the difference between Jerusalem and Athens. And I bring it up in relation to my teacher, Gregory Vlastos, great Plato scholar, who contrasted Socrates and Jesus over the thesis in the Gorgias that it is better to suffer injustice than to perpetrate it. And he pointed to the thesis as grounding in the interest of the perpetrator's soul, that when justice was defended in the Greek tradition, it was defended on the grounds of the individual's own interest. And it wasn't defined in relation to the victim, which is the concern of the prophetic voice of the Hebrew prophets, but also for Vlastos, a Christian, of Jesus. And so it seemed to me that, you know, we're assuming that democracy is the ultimate redemptive state of where we go. We obviously don't want a sovereign, a Schmittian sovereign. And we of course love a democratic world where everyone has the right to pursue their own dreams. But isn't that just another form of individualized sense of justice? Have we really actually attended to what Cohen was interested in when he himself divided his own position from Philo and from Plato precisely on the question of the mitmensch, of the person who is identified as mitmensch, as der Arme, as the one who is suffering, and that justice only takes place in a response to the suffering of the other. It seems not to necessarily take place with the establishment of democratic laws in which each of us is equal. That would be a good thing, but it doesn't necessarily answer to the question of the redemption of the other and the suffering of the other. So I was wondering how that other way of contrasting Jerusalem and Athens maps onto the picture that we're describing, that we've been listening to, and I think is so beautifully articulated in Miguel's book about the nature of anarchic democracy versus a form of sovereign rule that defines individuals within the framework of an autocratic and fully powerful Kratos empowered individual. Thanks.
I was wondering if we should concentrate the questions. We have 3 more, and then your response, because we have 7 minutes left. It's okay. So the next question is from Bernard Levy, who is a fellow at the CATS now. No?
I think my name is Bernard Levinson. So I have a bit of I admired the intellectual intensity of your work and the amount of synthetic work. I have a bit of a funny question, perhaps. I see a paradox. I see a paradox in your work. It seems to me that what you're saying is that theoretical sophistication in thinking about sovereignty and political theology begins with Philo. And in doing so, what you're doing is ironically turning the Hebrew Bible itself into a surd. That is, in effect, you're saying that there wasn't already within the Pentateuch, both in the narrative material and in the laws, already an ongoing sophistication about thinking about models of political government. In effect, what I'd like to ask is, what is the place of the Hebrew Bible itself and what is the place of biblical scholarship in your larger project? There are Bible scholars who are grappling with the same kind of issues that you are trying to address. And I don't see that dialogue in your work. And I think it would be a great opportunity to build on your project by taking account of this. Deuteronomy itself is thinking about some of the same ideas in a different way, and I think more powerfully than Philo, for example. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
And we have one more question from Lawrence Kaplan.
Yeah, yes. Well, perhaps you discussed this in your book, but I was wondering what happened to Buber, who, following up Arendt, speaks of the kingship of God, is opposed to a human king like Solomon and actually espouses anarchy. And just to broaden it to an Orthodox rabbinic thinker, Rabbi Joseph Soloveitchik, who influenced by Buber, and actually cites Buber's book on Moses in his Emergence of Ethical Man, is also suspicious of power, and he expresses his suspicion of power in many places, not many, but a good number of places, except he makes an exception for the power of the teacher, and actually also in a number of places, surprisingly, given the fact that he's a rabbinic thinker, but I think he's thinking in political terms, he also supports anarchy. So we seem to have an opposition, at least in Soloveitchik, type of suspicion of political power and support of the authority of the teacher, and of course the role of the law. So I just wanted to throw that into the mix.
You have 2 minutes for an answer.
Okay, yeah, thank you for all these questions. I do talk about Buber. I don't dedicate a whole chapter, although I was tempted. There's a lot of really good, including Nitzan, work on Buber versus Schmidt and Buber as a response to Schmidt. So I thought maybe not repeating that, but he is a very important. In fact, I kind of, in many ways, draw one of the motifs definitely from the phrase that Nitzan repeated about the anarchic solo theocracy, obviously from Buber's Kingdom of God and other things. And Bernard, yeah, no, absolutely. As I tried to say at the beginning, where I have a kind of methodological chapter, I am just trying to map out quite a very specific kind of discourse in the 20th century called political theology. And I do not pretend that this somehow at all comes close to mapping a political understanding of the Bible or much less rabbinical thought, or discussions on Zionism. It's all way too complicated. This is quite specific project and something that I see operative in these thinkers. In general, yes, I would say, of course, that I think Philo would not disagree, and in early Christianity and Hellenistic Judaism, there's a sort of saying, apocryphal, of course, that Plato is a student of Moses. So Plato learned his Republic from the Pentateuch and so on. So in a way, the whole book is a kind of seeing how this idea is mobilized in a very 20th century cultural conflict around political theology, which is essentially defined as the translation and in between political discourses, political and jurisprudential discourses and theology, whether it's theology that is secularized into politics or politics is secularized into religion and so on and so forth. So I don't mean to, it just so happens that these authors, they themselves sometimes go back to the Bible, sometimes go back to Plato. So in a way, you can't talk about them without talking about everything, but I don't intend to talk about everything. I just intend to talk about these people and what they might have had in mind. And Bruce, well, Bruce and I have spoken for years, so I'm not, I think we're on the same page on that.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Miguel, Paula, Martin, Nitzan, and David. Thank you, Natalie. The recording will be available at the CAT Center YouTube channel for those who want to listen to this interesting discussion. Could the participants stay on 2 more minutes? Thank you so much for coming, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie.
Yes, I reiterate Miriam's thanks and thank you for a fantastic discussion, everybody.